His children shouted from the porch, voices sharp in the damp afternoon air. "Dad, you're wasting your life," the eldest called, fists clenched around the railing. "This field is nothing but mud and mosquitoes. You'll lose everything." Water pooled at his boots, ankle deep, rippling gently as he stepped, sending small fish scuttling into reeds. The younger one shook his head, pacing along the porch boards, eyes scanning the soggy stretch of meadow as if its muddiness could confirm his father's insanity. The old man did not reply. He crouched beside a crooked fence post, fingers brushing against the blackened soil beneath the silt. Cold moisture seeped into his gloves. A thin stake marked a depression he had noted that morning, where water pooled unevenly, a subtle hint of something the others would never notice. He straightened, wiping a smear of mud from his weathered boots, and inhaled the scent of cedar and wet earth carried by the north wind. Somewhere under the mud, the meadow held a secret, patient and silent. Neighbors leaned against their cars along the dirt road, umbrellas shaking slightly in the drizzle. The dealer, hands stuffed into his pockets, muttered about lost money and foolish decisions. Rain pattered against the tin roof of the barn, echoing softly through the field. Sunlight filtered weakly through the gray clouds, glinting off tiny ripples on the water's surface, highlighting the stubborn green shoots poking from the soggy soil. Each sound, each glint, each small movement seemed to whisper that this land was more than it appeared. He stepped carefully across a narrow channel, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Every step pressed into the wet ground, deliberate, measured. The question hung in the cold air. Would he succeed in proving the meadow mattered, or would the world claim it before anyone ever understood? If you've ever believed some places hold stories the world forgot, consider subscribing. This is more than a flooded field. It's patience, promises, and secrets lingering beneath the soil. Stay with us. Every step he takes, every subtle shift of water, carries the quiet tension of decades. And what's coming next will test not just his resolve, but the truth hidden in a land everyone else dismissed. The eldest leaned over the porch railing, jaw tight, eyes following each careful step his father took through the muck. "Dad, this is reckless," he said, voice raised against the wind. "We could lose the farm if you keep going like this." The younger child folded arms, tapping fingers against a railing post, boots squeaking with each shift. Behind them, the barn's faded red siding reflected the dim sunlight, windows streaked with raindrops, tools hanging crookedly on pegboards inside, swinging gently as the wind nudged them. The old man crouched beside a stake, running a gloved hand over the damp wood, fingers tracing shallow grooves in the wet soil. He adjusted a narrow channel he had dug earlier, tilting it so that water trickled slowly toward a low depression. A faint shimmer of movement caught his eye, tiny ripples where pooled water met reeds so subtle the children didn't notice. He straightened, wiping mud from his boots onto the grass, glancing at his children's anxious faces. A gust of wind carried the cedar scent from the distant orchard, mingling with wet earth. He inhaled deeply, letting the smell anchor him. "You don't understand," the eldest snapped, stepping closer, voice quivering. "This swamp is going to ruin everything your mother and father worked for. You can't keep insisting." His words trailed off as the old man moved calmly to adjust another stake, fingers brushing against the dark, spongy soil. Every motion deliberate. The meadow seemed to respond subtly under his touch, a promise whispered in the mud, just beyond the children's perception. The tension built in silence. Water lapped faintly at the edges of his boots. A fallen fence plank groaned under the weight of wet wood. He knelt again, pressing a palm against the soil, feeling the cool give and subtle shift. He did not argue, did not raise his voice. The children fumed, their threats and pleas bouncing harmlessly off a man who was tired, aching, but unshakable. He finally rose, adjusting the brim of his hat, and took a slow step toward the far edge of the field, leaving a faint line of footprints in the mud, a small, deliberate assertion of control over the space everyone else dismissed. A notice pinned to the barn door flapped weakly in the drizzle. "You have 30 days," the county clerk had written, "to bring this property into compliance. Failure will result in seizure." The words seemed to vibrate in the wet air, mingling with the constant drip of water from the eaves. The stakes were clear. If he failed, the meadow and perhaps the legacy of decades would be lost. He squatted near a depression in the field, testing the soil, tracing subtle lines where water collected. The drizzle made it difficult to measure precisely, each small channel slipping back into the pooled water. His gloves were soaked, boots heavy, shoulders aching from hours of bending and kneeling. Every breath drew in the scent of damp earth and cedar from the orchard beyond, mingled with the faint tang of rusted metal from the barn's hinges. The children watched silently now, their frustration tempered by worry. They whispered about bills, repairs, and the impossibility of restoring the meadow in time. One of them gestured toward a decayed fence post. "It's hopeless, Dad," the younger murmured, stepping closer to point at the uneven channel he had tried to dig. The old man's fingers brushed a patch of dark soil near the base of the post, barely visible but firm, beneath his touch, a subtle reminder of resilience the others couldn't see. The wind picked up, sending tiny rivulets of rainwater running across the field. Each rivulet glimmered in the dim light, a small movement hinting at something beneath the mud. He adjusted stakes, smoothed channels, and tested angles, working silently, his face set with quiet determination. The stakes in the ground were more than markers. They were questions to the universe. Could he guide this meadow back to life before the world took it away? Could the spring, hidden for decades, remember him before the deadline passed? The dealer had returned, leaning against a fence, boots scraping mud as he shifted weight. "You're throwing money into this swamp," he said, voice low but firm, glancing at the soaked stakes and uneven channels. "Better machinery, better land. You're stubborn for no reason." A neighbor nodded, whispering to another, and the county clerk scribbled on his clipboard, the pen squeaking over damp paper. The old man did not flinch, though the rain-slicked hair clung to his forehead. He crouched near a narrow channel, running fingers along the dark soil, feeling the faint resistance, the subtle shift under his touch. A thin line of water trickled just beyond the reeds, glinting faintly. His breath fogged in the chill, mixing with the scent of wet cedar and the damp barn boards behind him. The dealer tapped his foot, glancing at the notice pinned to the gate. 30 days, he muttered, shaking his head. "After that, it's gone. You can't fight the system." The children flinched, whispering to each other, but the old man ignored them. Each step, each adjustment of a stake, was careful, deliberate. He pressed a palm into the mud near a depression, feeling the subtle shift, the way water tried to find its path. He tested the soil, noting the dark patches, the uneven flow, the reeds bending faintly over tiny rivulets. Every detail mattered. The world saw a swamp, a failure, a man clinging to folly. He saw potential, patience, and something quietly waiting beneath. As dusk approached, the meadow darkened under thickening clouds. The children retreated slightly, voices fading into murmurs. The old man knelt near a depression where the soil was darkest, pressing his fingers into it, feeling a cool, almost imperceptible give. He adjusted a stake a few inches, watching how the water shifted in response. The wind carried the faint scent of cedar from the distant orchard, rustling reeds along the far edge. A single drop of rain struck the base of a crooked fence post, making the mud quiver slightly. He brushed it with his fingers, noticing the subtle movement beneath a hint of something unseen, waiting. He straightened slowly, wiping mud from his gloves onto the grass, and took a careful step toward the far side of the meadow, boots leaving deep impressions. He looked back once at the fading light, at the worried, silent faces of his children and the withdrawn dealer, then forward at the line of stakes and channels he had laid out. He murmured softly, almost to himself, "Let's see if it remembers me." It was a simple gesture, barely perceptible, yet it carried the weight of decades of care, promise, and patience. Somewhere beneath, the meadow waited silently, ready to reveal what it had held hidden, and with that step, the question hung in the air, larger than the fading light. Will the meadow answer him, or will the world take it first? Rain had finally thinned to a mist that hung low over the meadow. He trudged along the muddy path leading back to the barn, boots leaving dark impressions in the wet soil. His hands, still damp and caked with mud, traced the edges of the wooden gate as if seeking balance after the day's turmoil. The wind carried a faint cedar scent from the orchard beyond, mingling with the earthy aroma of soaked soil and the metallic tang of tools left inside the barn. Each sound, the drip from the barn roof, the soft ripple of water along the edge of a trench, the distant creak of the fence seemed amplified in the quiet afternoon. He paused at the barn doorway, brushing rain from his brow, and glanced at the rows of worn tools hanging on pegboards. Hammers with rusted edges, spades darkened with old earth, and a wheelbarrow leaning slightly to one side. Each object felt heavier now, burdened with the weight of memory. His eyes lingered on a faint scar in the floorboards where the first snow had fallen years ago, a mark his wife had traced with her hand as she measured the distance for a tiny spring-fed channel she once imagined restoring. The children's shouts from earlier had faded into murmurs in his mind. Their urgency and worry still hung in the air, but here, among the familiar boards, the smell of oil and cedar, and the soft trickle of collected rainwater in shallow depressions, he could breathe. He pressed a hand lightly to the worn threshold, feeling the subtle give in the floor beneath a small reminder that even time-worn things could support weight, if handled carefully. A single crow called from the ridge, breaking the quiet, and he followed its shadow for a moment, letting the cool breeze settle around him. In this silence, the tension of judgment faded into the rhythm of memory and attention, a gentle cadence that reminded him why he had persisted this long. Years ago, she had walked beside him through these same rows, boots muddy from early spring rains. She carried a small journal, its leather cover softened and darkened from frequent use. Inside were sketches of the meadow, faint pencil marks indicating where water pooled, lines tracing the subtle inclines, small symbols marking the location of a spring she had once discovered in the northern corner. He could recall the scent of ink mingling with cedar smoke from the fireplace they had used to dry tools on cold evenings, and the way she had smiled as he knelt beside her to inspect the soil. She had been precise, patient, and impossibly observant. "See this patch?" she had said once, pointing at a small depression in the soil where water lingered. "It tells a story, if you take the time to listen." He had laughed softly, tipping his hat, and followed her gaze as she traced the subtle movements of water across the meadow. In that moment, the meadow had felt alive, not just a patch of land, but a narrative waiting to unfold. Her absence was now a quiet ache he carried, expressed not through words but through actions, smoothing channels, checking stakes, kneeling to feel soil with gloved hands. The journal remained on a shelf in the barn, its pages yellowed, edges soft with repeated handling. He would sometimes open it, running a finger along the pencil lines, tracing the path of water, remembering her gentle instructions and the way she had coaxed him to notice the smallest details. On rainy evenings, he would stand at the edge of the orchard, listening to the soft drum of water on leaves, imagining her voice pointing out a way to channel it. Those moments reminded him that his persistence was not stubbornness, but continuity, a promise made long ago, unspoken but binding. Even as the world outside the barn called his decisions folly, inside, he honored a rhythm learned decades ago: observation, care, and respect for the subtle intelligence of the land itself. He moved toward the workbench where a small, leather-bound journal lay beside an old, tarnished pair of glasses and a rusted tractor key. His fingers hovered over the journal before brushing lightly across the cover, feeling the subtle indentations made by decades of notes and sketches. The glasses were cracked at one corner, lenses smudged from years of use, yet they carried the weight of countless mornings spent poring over the soil, reading the subtle cues of water and terrain. The key, small and unassuming, seemed to vibrate with memory when he held it, a tangible connection to machinery she had loved and the promise they had shared to care for the meadow. He opened the journal gently, turning pages with care, revealing sketches of the spring-fed channels, faint annotations about soil texture, and symbols marking spots where reeds bent strangely or water pooled more deeply. He traced a pencil line with his thumb, feeling the indentation, almost like a pulse from the past. The afternoon light filtered through the barn window, casting narrow beams across the pages, highlighting fine lines of graphite and smudges left by her hand. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, pattering against the tin roof and creating a gentle rhythm that echoed through the barn. The movement of water in shallow troughs outside caught his attention, a subtle shimmer that mirrored the faint marks in the journal. He set the journal back carefully, adjusting his grip on the glasses and tucking the key into his coat pocket. The objects were silent witnesses to a past that informed every decision he made in the present, yet none revealed the full story. They hinted, suggested, nudged, but did not declare. He paused at the barn doorway, looking back at the meadow, watching how the last light touched the reeds, glinting faintly on water that had been trapped for weeks. A soft sigh escaped him, barely audible above the rhythm of rain and wind. With a deliberate step, he moved toward the edge of the field, the leather of his gloves brushing against the old wooden fence, marking the transition from memory to action. His eyes swept the horizon, settling on the dark patches in the mud and the faint bends of reeds. The spring waited beneath it all, patient, and he would follow. The journal, glasses, and key remained on the workbench, bathed in the waning light, quiet and unassuming, yet connected to every step he would take next. The question lingered as he walked toward the field. Could he honor the promise and see the meadow respond, or would time and tide claim what had been left behind? The flooded meadow stretched before him, a patchwork of shallow pools and bent reeds, glistening in the pale morning light. Neighbors leaned against their trucks along the dirt road, umbrellas dripping with lingering rain. "It's just a swamp," murmured one, shaking his head. "Nothing will grow there." The county clerk stepped cautiously along the edge, boots crunching in the mud, clipboard held tightly as if proximity might somehow validate the land's supposed worthlessness. Even his children hovered on the porch, frowning, exchanging worried glances. He stepped lightly into the meadow, gloved fingers brushing reeds, feeling the subtle resistance beneath. Tiny rivulets trickled along shallow channels, glinting in the soft light. To anyone else, it was waterlogged, unruly, a nuisance. To him, the patterns were deliberate, legible in a language only he could read. Slight slopes, the subtle change in soil color, and the way reeds leaned against one another, pointing to a faint depression near the northern edge. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet cedar and faint traces of iron from the barn's old tools. He crouched briefly, brushing mud from a low stake, and traced a finger along the dark soil. A small splash from a puddle, almost imperceptible, hinted at movement beneath the surface, a whisper of something unseen. He straightened and looked across the expanse, boots leaving deep impressions, eyes scanning every ripple and shadow. The dealer, leaning against a fence post, muttered to the clerk, "I've seen swampland, but this, it's hopeless." His tone carried no menace, just certainty, a quiet dismissal. The old man didn't respond. He let his gaze linger on the channel he had begun mapping, noting how the water tried to escape, where the soil shifted more easily. Every inch of the meadow had a story, though few could read it, and none would guess the faint signs hidden beneath the surface. He knelt beside a shallow depression, gloved hand pressing gently into the wet earth. The soil gave slightly, dark and rich, but hidden under layers of water and silt. Reeds brushed his sleeves as he adjusted a small stake, marking the angle of the natural incline. Each motion was careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic. A faint shimmer moved across the surface where the water pooled so slight that anyone else might think it was just wind. The barn behind him creaked softly as a loose board shifted in the breeze, tools hanging inside clinking gently. The smell of oil and cedar mixed with damp earth. A fallen wheelbarrow leaned against the barn's siding, rust eating at its edges. The old man let his hand hover briefly over it, noticing how it had held weight for decades. A small journal rested on a nearby shelf, corners worn, pages bent from repeated handling. He remembered her annotations, lines drawn across similar depressions, careful measurements in pencil, faint notes of where water had once run. A light drizzle began again, pattering against the brim of his hat, and forming tiny ripples on the puddles around him. He shifted one of the stakes a few inches, watching how the water subtly altered its path, slow and deliberate. No one else would notice these changes, the slightest bend of a reed, the darkening of a patch of soil, but to him, it spoke volumes. It was patience, attention, and memory combined, a language of the land that most had long forgotten. He straightened, boots sinking slightly in the mud, eyes scanning toward the northern edge, where the faintest slope hinted at deeper water. The sun broke briefly through clouds, spotlighting a cluster of reeds that leaned strangely, pointing to a hollow beyond. It was almost imperceptible, a gentle suggestion of something buried beneath the layers of rain and earth, waiting. His eldest child stepped onto the muddy path, boots squelching, voice hesitant. "Dad, are you sure this is worth it?" The words trembled with concern. The younger stayed back, leaning on a fence post, eyes wide. "We could lose everything if you keep going like this," they added softly. Their tones were worried, not mocking, but the pressure was palpable. He knelt again, brushing water from a low stake and noting the alignment. A small wave ran across the pooled water, catching the sunlight for a fraction of a second. He let his fingers hover above the dark mud, feeling the subtle give beneath, as if the meadow itself responded to his touch. A faint bend of reeds toward a low depression hinted at movement hidden below a small, secret rhythm the others could not perceive. A neighbor leaned from his truck, voice quiet but sharp. "Nothing will come of it. You're chasing ghosts in the mud." The old man glanced at him, eyes steady, but said nothing. He adjusted a stake, testing how the channel diverted water, then rose slowly, letting the movement of reeds brush against his coat sleeves. The barn behind him groaned softly as wind shifted the old tin roof, a rhythm blending with the dripping water and distant bird calls. He took a careful step toward the northern hollow, boots sinking in the mud, and pressed a hand briefly against a patch of dark soil. It yielded slightly, cool and firm beneath his fingers. He straightened and looked toward the horizon, where light and shadow mingled over the meadow. His lips pressed together in a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, an acknowledgement of the challenge, a quiet assertion of resolve. With one last glance at the skewed stakes, the bending reeds, and the glinting water, he whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "We'll see if you're still there." It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, the first of many movements to come. The meadow, silent and patient, awaited the next step, and the question lingered in the air. Would it reveal its story when the time was right? He knelt at the edge of the marshy meadow, boots sinking into the dark mud, his hands pressed into the soil, probing for the firmer patches beneath the shallow water. Each channel he dug seemed to resist, collapsing partially as he tried to redirect the trickle toward the low depression at the northern corner. A few reeds bent sharply under his weight, and he pushed them aside, feeling the tug against the wet stems. Tiny fish darted in the shallow water, scattering as his hands disturbed the surface. Rain misted lightly from the overcast sky, soft droplets landing on his hat and gloves, mixing with the mud that had already caked to the sleeves of his coat. The stakes he had placed the day before wobbled slightly as he adjusted the channels, forcing water along the intended path, only for it to seep back into the surrounding puddles. He tested the soil with a shovel, the edge sticking and slipping in the saturated earth. Even with careful effort, the channels refused to cooperate fully, breaking apart as fast as he could shape them. He exhaled slowly, brushing mud from his hands, and examined the slope again. The northern corner of the meadow held a subtle depression where water tended to pool. He leaned forward, fingertips grazing the dark soil, noticing the faint difference in texture, a slight give that suggested something more beneath the surface. A small shimmer ran across the water, caught in the misty light, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind him that patience and precise motion mattered. The barn behind him creaked as a loose board shifted in the wind. Tools clinked softly against pegboards, the smell of cedar and oil drifting in the cool air. He adjusted a stake once more, tilting it a fraction, observing how the water responded, though not entirely as he wished. His back ached, shoulders stiff, gloves soaked, his boots squelched with every careful step. He had begun this labor fully aware of his limits, age, fatigue, uneven soil, and weather, but continued methodically, tracing lines of water, adjusting, remeasuring, refusing to abandon the first attempt despite its partial failure. From the porch, his eldest called again, voice tense but quieter than before. "Dad, please. This isn't just mud. You're risking everything: our savings, the farm, your health." The younger sibling leaned over the railing, frowning, fingers tapping the wood nervously. "Why are you so stubborn? Just stop. Please." He straightened slightly, eyes scanning the gentle rise of the meadow, then back at the children. He did not answer with words, only adjusted the position of a stake in a shallow channel, feeling the soil shift under his palm. The action was subtle, almost a shrug, but communicated persistence. The children watched, exasperation mingling with worry, realizing he would not stop for pleading alone. A thin drizzle dampened the porch boards and streaked their coats. He shifted his weight, testing the soil near the edge, mud sticking to his gloves. Each careful touch, each tiny movement of stakes and channels reflected years of experience. The subtle glint of water catching in a small depression near the northern boundary hinted at potential, though the children could not perceive it. Their concern hung heavy, a quiet pressure that settled in his chest, reminding him that the stakes were real, financial, emotional, and personal. Yet his hands continued to work, steady, deliberate, aware of limits. A truck rumbled along the dirt road, halting beside the barn. The dealer stepped down, coat damp, boots leaving deep impressions in the mud. "Walter," he said, voice low but firm, "I'm telling you, this isn't just stubbornness. You're throwing effort into a swamp. If you don't act fast, the county could claim this land. They'll enforce that notice soon." He glanced at the stakes, the shallow channels, as though measuring success with his eyes alone. The county clerk arrived moments later, clipboard in hand, reading aloud the warning once again. Any failure to maintain proper drainage or prepare the property by the inspection date will result in seizure. 30 days. He folded the paper crisply, tapping it against the palm of his hand, watching for a reaction. The words carried authority, weight, and a sense of immediacy. The old man knelt near a depression, fingers tracing the dark soil, testing its texture, the way water ran against the edges of a partial channel. He adjusted a stake, tilting it slightly, and watched as the water responded in subtle ripples, not fully flowing as intended, but enough to suggest the earth might yet comply. His shoulders ached, gloves muddy, boots heavy, but he pressed on with measured steps, boots squelching in wet soil, tools in hand, rain tapping on the brim of his hat. A faint gleam caught his eye, a subtle shift in water along a bend of reeds near the northern corner. It was imperceptible, easily dismissed, yet his trained eye noted it. The dealer and clerk exchanged glances, whispering as they stepped back, leaving a weight of observation and pressure behind. The meadow had not yielded, but for the first time, a small anomaly made him wonder whether the resistance was truly natural or if someone else understood more than they admitted. He straightened, fingers brushing mud from gloves, eyes sweeping the horizon. The stakes, reeds, and channels formed a pattern only he could read. He stepped carefully toward the far edge, leaving a deep impression in the soft soil. With a subtle tilt of his head, he exhaled slowly, the rain dripping from his hat, and murmured almost inaudibly, "Let's see what you'll show me." The gesture was small, but deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that the first attempt had revealed something unexpected, and the next steps might change everything. He crouched once more at the northern edge of the meadow, gloved hands brushing against dark, wet soil. The stakes he had positioned the day before wobbled slightly, and he adjusted one with careful pressure, testing the flow of water along the shallow channel. Mud squelched beneath his boots as he shifted weight, sending a ripple through a small puddle. The drizzle had slowed to a fine mist, but the earth remained stubborn, pockets of pooled water resisting his guidance. He leaned over the depression, fingertips grazing the soil, noting subtle variations in firmness. A clump of reeds bent unexpectedly in the corner of his eye, and he paused, tilting a stake slightly to redirect the shallow trickle. It moved, just barely, slipping along the path he had intended, but enough to suggest that persistence might yield results. Behind him, the barn's old roof groaned with the wind, tools on pegboards jingling softly, and the faint smell of wet cedar and iron-laden mud filled the air. He shifted, pressing a palm into a particularly damp patch, feeling the soil's slight give and the way the reeds responded. It was a minor, almost imperceptible change, yet it hinted that the land was beginning to cooperate, if only fractionally. He exhaled slowly, eyes sweeping across the field, boots sinking slightly in the mud, aware of the fragility of this first sign. A faint shimmer ran along the edge of a shallow channel, catching the soft morning light. Water, which had previously pooled and stalled, began to follow a subtle incline, slipping past reeds and over uneven soil. The movement was minimal but undeniable. He knelt and adjusted another stake, tilting it slightly, and watched the flow respond in tiny ripples. The darkened soil beneath shifted just enough to confirm a change. The meadow had acknowledged his efforts in a way that could be observed. His eldest child, who had lingered near the edge of the porch, leaned forward, eyebrows knitting as they took in the subtle motion. "Is that moving?" they whispered, voice tentative. The younger sibling stepped closer, toes sinking into mud, and watched the narrow trickle follow the faint slope he had prepared. Neither spoke further, caught between disbelief and curiosity. The old man crouched lower, fingertips pressing lightly into the soil, feeling the slight resistance and gradual flow. A few reeds bent as the water passed, their movement gentle but definite. The barn behind him creaked softly, a tool shifted on the pegboard inside, a drop of water ran along the tin roof, and the smell of wet cedar mixed with iron-tinged mud. Each tiny sound and motion emphasized the meadow's response, subtle but tangible. He traced the channel with gloved fingers, noting how the water skimmed the depression he had marked earlier, reflecting light in a narrow streak. The effect was small, but concrete, a minor validation of his careful efforts. It wasn't triumph. Not yet, but it gave him a glimmer of hope that the painstaking adjustments could influence the flow. He straightened slightly, water dripping from his hat, and exhaled slowly, scanning the horizon for any other subtle shifts that might indicate the land's quiet compliance. Across the meadow, the dealer shifted uneasily, glancing at the stakes and the channel. He muttered under his breath, a brief, the kind that suggested doubt. The county clerk scribbled on the clipboard, eyes flicking toward the subtle movement in the water. Neither expressed certainty, but the tension of observation hung in the damp air. The meadow had spoken faintly, just enough to sow hesitation among those who had doubted him. The eldest child's shoulders relaxed slightly, a mix of relief and uncertainty in their expression. They glanced at the younger sibling, then back at the old man, as if reconsidering what they had assumed. Maybe he knows more than we thought," the eldest murmured, voice low. They did not step forward or interfere, only watched, shifting weight from one boot to the other. The dealer exhaled sharply, gaze narrowing at the water's faint movement along the channel. He adjusted the brim of his hat and glanced at the county clerk, who had stopped writing, eyes lingering on the subtle ripple in the pool. Their demeanor suggested curiosity, perhaps mild concern, but not acceptance. Not yet. The meadow's response had created doubt without confirming anything. The old man took a slow step toward the depression where the water's slight shift was most visible. His boots sank into the mud, leaving deep impressions, and he pressed a gloved hand into the soil, feeling the give beneath his palm. A reed brushed against his sleeve, and he bent to adjust it slightly, tilting it just enough to influence the flow. The effect was minor, but definite, a whisper of the land's potential, and a small confirmation that his effort had not been wasted entirely. He straightened, rain dampening his coat, and exhaled, eyes sweeping the horizon where stakes marked subtle channels, reeds bent faintly, and puddles shimmered. His lips pressed together briefly, almost imperceptibly, as he whispered under his breath, "Let's see what else will move." The phrase was small, quiet, but it carried weight. The first sign was visible. Observers were shifting in perception, and the meadow had begun to hint at its secrets. The question lingered, heavier than before. What else is waiting beneath the surface? And will anyone else notice it before it reveals itself fully? The morning sun had begun to pierce the low-hanging clouds, casting faint golden streaks across the flooded meadow. He crouched at the northern depression, gloved fingers pressing into the dark soil, testing its firmness. The water he had guided yesterday now rippled faintly along the channel, bending reeds with a subtle rhythm. Each careful movement of his hand adjusted the shallow flow, but the earth resisted stubbornly in patches, and a few stakes wobbled precariously in the saturated mud. Rain from the previous night had left small puddles and depressions, reflecting fragments of sky and reeds. The air smelled of wet cedar and iron-laced soil, a familiar combination that anchored him to the task at hand. He adjusted a stake again, tilting it to redirect the tiny stream, watching the water hesitate before yielding just enough. The subtle shift glimmered in the sun, a hint that the land might be responding more decisively, though not yet fully. From the porch, his eldest child leaned forward, gripping the railing, eyes wide and hesitant. The younger sibling shuffled closer, toes sinking into the mud. Neither spoke, but their attention sharpened. Even the dealer, who had remained at the edge of the field, straightened, eyes narrowing at the faint ripple. The county clerk's pen had paused mid-scribble, a subtle tilt of the head betraying his observation. None said a word, but the atmosphere grew taut, as if anticipation itself had weight. He breathed slowly, pressing a palm lightly into a small mound of mud, feeling the soil shift beneath his touch. A faint shimmer in the channel caught the corner of his eye. Not yet a revelation, not yet a solution, but something tangible, a sign that his efforts, painstaking and partial, were beginning to interact with the meadow in a meaningful way. He straightened, glancing across the faintly bending reeds, preparing for the moment when the subtle would become undeniable. He leaned closer to the northern hollow, fingers brushing along a narrow channel where water now flowed with more consistency than the day before. Tiny rivulets glimmered in the morning sun, moving along paths he had traced with stakes and careful measurements. Dark soil patches, once resistant, gave just enough to allow water to trickle smoothly toward a shallow depression. The reeds followed the subtle curves, bending as if acknowledging a path laid out decades ago, patiently waiting. A glint of something metallic caught his eye near a cluster of reeds. He crouched, brushing aside mud and water with gloved hands. Beneath the wet silt, a small iron marker, a survey pin left long ago, was partially exposed. Its presence confirmed what the foreshadowing had suggested. The northern slope, previously dismissed as worthless, had contours he had intended, guiding water with a natural precision. He traced the line with his fingers, feeling the soil shift slightly, the water following in a soft, measurable movement. The eldest child stepped forward cautiously, eyes fixed on the channel. I didn't think it could move like that," they whispered. The younger sibling stood still, leaning on the railing, lips pressed together, brow furrowed. They had seen only subtle trickles before, but now the flow was undeniable, a tangible, observable sign that the meadow responded. The dealer, standing nearby, furrowed his brow, stepping closer. That's..." His voice trailed off, replaced by a low murmur to the county clerk, who had frozen mid-note, eyes locked on the bending reeds and shifting water. The channel carried water past the depression, pooling slightly in a previously stagnant hollow. The reeds bent in faint arcs, and the sun reflected in narrow lines across the shallow water. The effect was small, precise, and undeniable, a real, measurable response from the meadow. The stakes he had adjusted held the alignment, though some wobbled precariously, reminding him that the system was fragile and unfinished. He pressed a hand into the soil at the edge of the pool, feeling the subtle give, noting the moisture distribution. The water shimmered as it moved along the slight incline, tiny bubbles breaking the surface. His lips pressed together in a brief, imperceptible motion, acknowledging that this was not victory, merely evidence. Yet even this modest confirmation shifted perception. Those who had doubted him now paused, uncertainty creeping into their faces. A faint hum of wind moved through the reeds, mingling with the drip from the barn roof and the subtle gurgle of water in the shallow channel. Light caught a small mound, highlighting the irregularity in soil that had guided the flow. The field itself seemed to whisper, patient, measured, hinting at the deeper forces beneath the surface. He straightened slowly, brushing mud from gloves, and let his gaze sweep across the meadow, the stakes, the bends in the reeds, the shimmering water. It was enough to silence some of the whispering, enough to plant doubt, but not enough to explain why the spring had been hidden for decades. The eldest child exhaled softly, shifting on the porch. Maybe he wasn't wrong, they murmured, eyes fixed on the faint movement in the northern hollow. The younger sibling's lips parted, hands gripping the railing, as if they were reconsidering everything they had assumed about the meadow. They did not step forward, did not interfere, only observed, a quiet acknowledgement forming in the weight of their posture. The dealer's brow tightened, eyes narrowing as he scanned the stakes, the channel, the subtle arcs of bent reeds. He shifted uneasily, muttering under his breath, a low, that carried a hint of tension. The county clerk's pen remained suspended above the clipboard, mid-note, eyes flicking repeatedly between the channel and the old man. Their authority remained intact, but the previous certainty had eroded. Something in the field had altered perception, though it had not fully solved the puzzle or revealed its ultimate secret. The old man stepped back, boots sinking slightly into the mud, fingers brushing a stake to steady it. He adjusted his hat, exhaled, and let his gaze sweep the horizon. Light reflected across the shallow pools, highlighting the subtle shifts in flow, the bending reeds, and the dark patches of soil. The meadow had spoken just enough to create doubt, curiosity, and cautious observation among those who had dismissed him for weeks. He took a slow step toward the northern hollow again, pressing his palm lightly into the mud. A faint ripple ran along the channel where he had adjusted the soil, catching sunlight in narrow, shimmering streaks. He straightened and whispered softly, almost to himself, "Let's see what else waits." It was not triumph. It was a moment suspended between uncertainty and potential. The land had revealed enough to change assumptions, enough to raise questions, and enough to hint that what lay beneath the surface might be far larger than anyone imagined. The meadow stretched out before him, patient and silent, the stakes and reeds forming a delicate network that only careful observation could interpret. He could feel the tension in the air. Children paused, dealer and clerk watched more closely, and the light glinted across the moving water, carrying a quiet signal that the land was alive, responsive, and holding secrets still unrevealed. A single, small detail, a subtle shimmer along the northern depression left the question lingering, heavier than before. If the meadow can respond this way, what else has been waiting for someone who would notice? Rain had started to fall again, fine but persistent, soaking the stakes and channels he had carefully adjusted. The northern depression glimmered faintly under the muted sunlight, water moving along the narrow path he had created. A truck rolled up the dirt road, mud flinging against the edges of the field, and the dealer climbed out, boots sinking slightly. He surveyed the subtle movement of water, brow furrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "Walter," he said, voice low but firm, "I don't care if the water moves a little. One storm and it will wash away. You're risking your equipment and our timeline. I can't let that happen." He gestured toward the county clerk standing near the barn, clipboard in hand, who nodded gravely. The clerk added, "Inspection is due in 20 days. If drainage isn't functional, enforcement action will proceed. There will be no exceptions." He tapped the edge of the clipboard, eyes flicking to the faint ripples along the channels. The tension in their stance suggested more than bureaucracy. They were measuring, calculating, waiting to see if the old man's methods would hold. The old man knelt near a stubborn patch of reeds, tilting a stake to guide a thin stream of water along a partial depression. The flow moved, but unevenly, breaking into small pools and low spots. He pressed a gloved hand into the mud, testing firmness, adjusting subtly, aware that even this minor shift might not satisfy the dealer or the clerk. A faint metallic glint peeked from the mud near the northern edge, a hint of something buried beneath, unnoticed by anyone else. He straightened slowly, exhaling, aware that this small sign might make them pause, but only just. From the porch, his eldest child called out, voice tense, "Dad, the county, the neighbors, they're watching closely now. If you don't stabilize it, they might enforce the notice early." The younger sibling shuffled closer, toes sinking into the wet boards, lips pressed together, eyebrows furrowed. Both were silent observers, caught between worry and growing curiosity about the subtle movements in the meadow. A neighbor stepped into the mud, boots squelching, holding a measuring tape. "I'll help check the slopes," he said quietly, scanning the stakes and channels. "You don't have to do this alone, but if the inspection comes and the water doesn't flow, they'll cite the land." The barn creaked behind them, tools clinking softly from the wind, shifting the loose boards. Rain dripped along the tin roof, punctuating the tense silence. The dealer paced the edge of the field, glancing repeatedly at the stakes and the faintly moving water. "I've warned you. Equipment failure, unstable soil, one heavy rain, it could all collapse. Are you sure this is safe?" His tone was measured, almost concerned, but carried the weight of obligation. Even minor errors could trigger penalties or escalate enforcement. The old man adjusted a stake near the northern hollow, pressing into the mud, watching the water trickle along its intended path. The flow remained imperfect, but enough that his child's eyes widened slightly, a small acknowledgement that the effort had effect. He shifted another stake, watching reeds bend gently as water moved past them. The stakes, water, and mud formed a delicate pattern he could read. Everyone else could only observe, curiosity tinged with doubt and apprehension. He stepped toward the northern depression, boots sinking into wet earth, fingers pressing lightly into a patch of dark soil. A faint ripple ran along the shallow channel he had adjusted, bending reeds slightly, catching sunlight in narrow streaks. The effect was small, fragile, but visible enough to spark quiet recognition in observers. His eldest child shifted weight, brow furrowed, voice quiet. "Dad, maybe there's more here than we thought." They did not approach, did not speak further, but their hesitation and narrowed gaze suggested the first flicker of doubt. The younger sibling remained near the porch, leaning on the railing, glancing at the shimmering water, worry and intrigue mingling on their face. The dealer stepped closer, boots caked with mud, hands gripping the brim of his hat. "I don't know what you've done differently," he muttered, eyes scanning the subtle water movement, "but keep it up, or one misstep, and the county will enforce the notice." The clerk, clipboard under arm, scribbled briefly before pausing, glancing at the flowing channel. Their authority remained intact, yet the certainty had shifted. The old man pressed a hand into the soil, tilting a stake to guide a narrow trickle along the depression. Water responded faintly, flowing along the intended path, bending reeds just enough to glimmer in sunlight. A metallic edge caught his eye, part of a survey pin left long ago, exposed just enough to shine in the morning light. A subtle, almost imperceptible clue that something beneath the meadow had influenced the movement, waiting for careful observation. He straightened, taking a slow step back, boots sinking into mud. Rain pattered softly on his hat, dripping from barn eaves, water pooling along the edges of small channels. The stakes and reeds formed a pattern only he could interpret, hinting that the land itself might hold answers yet unrevealed. He exhaled slowly, eyes sweeping the horizon. The small metallic glint and faint ripples suggested a deeper story, one that would demand attention soon. "Let's see what else waits," he murmured softly, barely audible, a gesture to the meadow, the stakes, and the watchers. The question hung heavier than ever. If the meadow could reveal this much now, what might it show next, and would anyone act in time to witness it? He trudged across the northern edge of the meadow, boots sinking into the saturated mud. Stakes leaned slightly from the morning breeze, and water glimmered along the channels he had painstakingly aligned. Fingers brushed the soil as he approached the depression where a faint metallic glint had caught his attention earlier, a partially buried survey pin. The tip reflected the sun in a narrow streak, guiding him toward a small hollow that had always seemed unremarkable. A thin layer of silt coated the depression, and he knelt, brushing it aside with careful motions, revealing the top of a small, rusted tin box, hidden beneath. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, dripping onto the muddy rim. The barn behind him creaked under the wind, a soft clatter of tools inside accentuating the quiet. He pressed his palm against the mud, feeling the soil give slightly around the box as though it had waited decades for discovery. He exhaled, gloved fingers probing the latch. The tension was high, the morning sun casting long shadows across the channel. The old journal lay partially open nearby on a raised wooden stake, hinting at connections between the depression and the spring-fed patterns he had been tracking. This small, tangible object, the tin box, was his doorway to clarity, to the full truth that had eluded observers for decades. He lifted the lid slowly, the hinges protesting with a faint squeak. Inside lay a neatly folded bundle of papers, yellowed but intact, accompanied by a small, annotated map and a few sketches. He pulled out the top sheet, a letter, roughly 100 words, penned decades earlier by the previous owner of the meadow. The words were concise, almost austere. "This meadow has been overlooked, but it carries water beneath in a hidden seam. Protect it carefully. What lies here is not for profit, but for the generations who tend this land and honor its history." He set the letter aside and unfolded the map, tracing with his finger the gentle incline that led toward the depression. Survey notes marked subtle contours, faint but precise, indicating channels that guided water naturally from the hidden spring. The sketches illustrated the depression, the reeds, and the slight rises that controlled flow exactly as he had observed and adjusted in the past days. The eldest child stepped forward, boots crunching softly in mud. Their eyes widened, lips parted. "Dad, all this, It's been here the whole time? The younger sibling's hand hovered over the railing, fingers brushing wood nervously. Neither spoke more. The revelation was tangible enough to silence them, yet the full significance remained partially hidden. The dealer leaned closer to inspect, brow furrowed, shifting uneasily on the muddy ground. I didn't expect this, he muttered, glancing at the faint lines traced on the map and the alignment of stakes. Even the county clerk's pen froze mid-note, eyes lingering on the depression and the now clearly directed flow. They observed, cautious, hesitant, a shift in their certainty. He traced the water with gloved fingers, noticing the way it pooled slightly along the contours indicated in the notes. Tiny bubbles rose from the depression where water seeped through, reeds bending subtly. The meadow itself confirmed his suspicions. The spring was real, hidden, and connected to the historical layout noted in the journal and tin box. The evidence was concrete, verifiable, but far from complete. He pressed his hand into the mud and exhaled, aware that the full scale and implications of the spring were still concealed beneath the surface. He straightened, water dripping from the brim of his hat, boots caked in mud. The letters and map lay before him, tangible proof that the meadow held more than anyone had assumed. It was not just soil, water, or reeds, it was a legacy. A promise had been kept silently, decades long, and it carried ethical weight, respect for the land, care for future generations, and the trust placed by those who had hidden it. His eldest child stepped closer, voice soft, careful. So, this isn't just about dirt and water. It's history, responsibility. Their eyes flicked to the narrow channel where water now moved in a controlled ribbon, bending reeds with precision. The younger sibling leaned on the railing, gripping the wood, absorbing the moment's gravity. The dealer adjusted the brim of his hat, squinting at the depression. I didn't think it mattered this way, he muttered, hesitant. The county clerk's eyes lingered on the bubbling water in the tin box, the tension in their stance hinting at a dawning awareness that the meadow's value was moral and communal, not just practical. The old man pressed lightly on the edge of the hollow, feeling the soil's slight give. He breathed slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. This was not triumph, it was clarity. The secret, long hidden, carried a responsibility he could not ignore. The land's preservation, the spring's protection, and the ethical choice of how and when to reveal it to the world. He rose slowly, brushing mud from gloves and coat sleeves. The tin box, journal, and map were now in his hands, tangible links to decades of foresight, diligence, and ethical intention. He surveyed the meadow, the stakes, the reeds, the shimmering water following the contours he had reinforced. The choice was clear: protect the spring, decide when to disclose the truth, and determine how the knowledge would serve the family and community. The eldest child watched quietly, uncertainty and awe mingling in their expression. The younger sibling's lips pressed together, as if weighing the implications of what had been discovered. Even the dealer and county clerk shifted subtly, lingering, sensing the significance without fully grasping it. He pressed a hand lightly into the dark soil near the bubbling spring, tilting a stake to guide the shallow water along the intended path. The reeds bent slightly in response, a subtle confirmation. He exhaled, squinting toward the horizon where the stakes marked a delicate network across the meadow. His decision would shape not only the flow of water but the preservation of legacy, honor, and trust. Finally, he murmured under his breath, almost imperceptibly, "Let's see who will keep it, and who will lose it if we wait too long." The words hung in the misty morning air, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had been revealed, but the ethical choice, the responsibility, and the consequences of action remained, ready to unfold in. The dealer stood at the edge of the northern hollow, boots sinking slightly in the mud. He shifted weight uneasily, eyes lingering on the water flowing through the channels, and the depression that had begun to reveal movement. He exhaled, pulling the brim of his wet hat lower. "Walter, I underestimated this," he said quietly, voice tight. Not an explanation, not a lecture, just acknowledgement. He bent down and adjusted one of the stakes he had questioned before, pressing it slightly to stabilize the channel, a subtle act that carried weight. Nearby, the county clerk watched, clipboard still in hand, pen poised but unmoving. Even they paused, noting the precision of the water flow and the alignment of reeds. The dealer's shoulders slumped slightly, a brief sign of concession. He stepped back, boots squelching in mud, glancing at the channel once more. "I'll be honest," he murmured under his breath. "I didn't see it coming. I'll keep an eye on it properly from now on." The eldest child shifted on the porch, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the channel. The younger sibling leaned slightly forward, gaze intent. Their father's steady hands adjusted stakes, tilting the flow, but his eyes flicked occasionally at the dealer, noting the subtle movement and action replacing words, a tangible demonstration of apology and recognition. The tension in the morning mist seemed to ease just slightly, though stakes, responsibility, and expectation remained high. He pressed a gloved hand into the mud, testing firmness, adjusting a slight tilt in a stake, letting water slip past reeds. It was a small correction, yet meaningful. An acknowledgement without words, an apology carried in deliberate, physical motion. The dealer nodded once, eyes flicking toward the horizon where stakes and channels formed a faint, intricate network proof of oversight corrected, but far from complete resolution. The dealer moved along the channel, mud squelching under his boots. He knelt carefully near the northern hollow, taking a wooden mallet from his truck. With deliberate taps, he reinforced a few stakes that had wobbled in the recent rain. Each strike pressed them deeper into the soil, guiding the water along the channel. Tiny ripples followed, bending reeds gently, and the faint glimmer of water reflected sunlight across the shallow depression. He reached into his truck bed and retrieved a coil of thin rope and some sandbags. The sandbags were placed along vulnerable sections of the channel, holding soil and reeds in place to prevent erosion. Each adjustment was precise, no words exchanged, only the rhythm of deliberate action. Water trickled past, following the intended path more smoothly than before. It was small, but effective, a physical demonstration of restitution rather than empty apologies. The county clerk, clipboard held loosely, observed silently as the dealer secured the last sandbag. A faint nod of acknowledgement passed between them. Neither spoke, but tension and scrutiny softened slightly. The community watching from the edges began to stir, neighbors leaning forward, children gripping the railing, noticing the stakes aligned, reeds bending in coordination, water flowing steadily. The eldest child stepped forward, toes sinking in mud, eyes wide. "I didn't think he'd actually." They trailed off, watching the dealer's careful work stabilize the channel. The younger sibling remained near the porch, expression taut with curiosity and concern. The old man knelt at the northern depression, adjusting a stake by a fraction, guiding water along its channel. He pressed a hand into the mud, feeling subtle shifts, listening to the faint gurgle as the stream followed the depression naturally. He rose slowly, surveying the meadow, stakes, reeds, and water forming an alignment that hinted at what was beneath. The tin box and journal lay nearby, untouched but present, evidence of the path forward. He exhaled, letting the action of the dealer and the movement of water communicate what words could not: repair, acknowledgement, and a beginning of redemption. The eldest child walked slowly toward the northern depression, boots leaving faint impressions in mud. Fingers brushed reeds and stakes, tracing the path water followed. Their gaze flicked between the depression, the aligned stakes, and the faint shimmer of the stream. They glanced at the younger sibling, who nodded slightly, lips pressed together, absorbing the moment quietly. Neighbors had moved closer, boots squelching, eyes following the faint arcs of water and the bending reeds. A faint whisper passed between them, soft acknowledgement that the meadow was no longer dismissed as merely mud and reeds. The channel responded, tangible evidence of effort and insight. The dealer straightened, stepping back from the edge of the hollow, gloved hand resting on his hip. No words were needed. The sandbags, reinforced stakes, and subtle flow of water spoke louder than anything he could say. The county clerk adjusted his stance, pen hovering, silently recording the evidence. The community's attention had shifted, curiosity and cautious respect settling into the space once filled with doubt. The old man walked slowly along the depression, boots sinking into the mud, fingers pressing lightly on the stakes. The water rippled, reeds swayed. He exhaled softly, surveying the aligned channels and shimmering stream. His eyes lingered on the journal and tin box, considering what to protect and share. The meadow had begun to reveal its story, the first step of healing and redemption taking root. The stakes, the water, the reeds, they were preparing the stage for the next chapter, where legacy, restoration, and the final reflection would unfold. Months had passed. The meadow, once flooded and overlooked, now held a quiet stability. Stakes remained aligned, channels guiding water subtly, reeds bending in rhythmic arcs. Patches of dark soil glistened where spring-fed water emerged gently, threading through the shallow depressions. Morning light streamed through the lingering mist, highlighting a faint shimmer along the northern hollow, the depression that had first revealed the hidden flow. The old man walked slowly along the channel, gloved fingers brushing the stakes he had positioned weeks earlier. Boots sank slightly into the damp earth, and water gurgled softly against the edges of the shallow pools. The barn behind him creaked with the breeze, tin roof panels shifting just enough to jingle the tools inside. The air smelled of wet cedar and earth, faint iron from stakes lingering in the scent. His eldest child stepped closer, following the narrow stream, careful not to disturb it. The younger sibling lingered near the porch, eyes attentive, observing how water flowed smoothly now along the channel. Neither spoke, words were unnecessary. The meadow's quiet, deliberate movement conveyed patience, persistence, and continuity. The old man pressed a hand briefly into the dark soil near the depression, feeling the slight give beneath, a reminder that life, effort, and trust could endure. Neighbors walked along the edges of the meadow, boots leaving impressions in softened soil. A few helped adjust minor stakes, clear debris, or steady reeds, their actions deliberate and careful. The flow of water responded smoothly along the depression, bending reeds and shimmering across shallow pools. Each ripple, each subtle movement, became tangible proof of what persistence, care, and attention could achieve. The eldest child knelt near the northern channel, fingers brushing lightly over the soil, nudging reeds to maintain alignment. "It's steady," they whispered. The younger sibling's hand hovered over a stake, adjusting gently. Their gestures mirrored the old man's careful motions from weeks past, a quiet lesson of diligence and responsibility passing from one generation to the next. The barn, still weathered but solid, stood behind them as a frame for this quiet renewal. Tools hung neatly, journals and tin boxes remained in their place, tangible connections to the work and discoveries made. The depression where the spring flowed now carried water steadily, feeding reeds and small pools, providing life to the meadow, and silently signaling that secrets once hidden could sustain the land if tended with care. A neighbor set a small hand-painted sign beside the northern hollow, "Protected Meadow, Stewardship Required." It was a subtle acknowledgement, not proclamation, that the meadow's significance had been recognized. The dealer observed quietly, hands tucked into his coat pockets, nodding once, while the county clerk adjusted the clipboard, lingering at the edge. Evidence of effort, observation, and ethical action had begun to reshape perception. He pressed his gloved hand lightly on a stake, tilting it to maintain flow, and exhaled slowly. Water moved along the channel, reeds bent gently, sunlight glimmered on the surface, and the meadow whispered a soft rhythm. Life stabilized, legacy ensured, patience rewarded. The first time he had heard his children say the meadow was worthless, rain had fallen, pooling in shallow hollows, reeds bending under the weight of skepticism. Now, he stood at the same northern hollow, sunlight warming the soil, water flowing deliberately along channels he had carved with care. Reeds swayed in gentle arcs, shimmering in the light, echoing the rhythm of the first day but transformed. The field now carried life, proof of persistence, and the trust of those who had watched silently. He bent briefly, pressing a hand to the soil near the depression. The glint of the metallic survey pin caught sunlight, a small signal, a link to the work of decades past. Channels were stable, water flowing gently, reeds bending predictably. The tin box and journal lay on the raised board nearby, untouched, silent witnesses to patience, diligence, and the ethical responsibility that had guided him all along. His eldest child leaned on the edge of the depression, eyes wide but calm. "It's alive," they murmured softly. The younger sibling mirrored the observation, fingers resting lightly on a stake. They did not speak further. Their silence carried awe and understanding. The meadow had shifted from object of doubt to symbol of stewardship and care. The barn's weathered boards creaked softly in the wind. Birds called from the distant orchard, the scent of wet cedar and soil lingering in the air. He straightened, letting the breeze brush his coat, exhaling slowly. The channel, the depression, the flowing water, the bent reeds, they all whispered continuity, patience, and endurance. The meadow, once dismissed, now carried life, trust, and legacy. He stepped lightly across the depression, boots pressing softly into the soil, and glanced back once. The subtle shimmer of water caught sunlight in narrow arcs, bending reeds in gentle rhythm, echoing the first moment he had walked this field months before. He murmured softly, a quiet reflection, almost to himself, "Let it last."